Welcome, I'm Kazumi, and this is a devlog for a Souls-like game I'm developing. In this devlog, I'll show you how I added front and back grabs. Before I show the development process, let's see the final result and break down how everything works. First off, there's now a physical cast always in front of the player that caches the last object it hit or set it to null if nothing was hit. When the player presses a button to attack, a check is made with that cast information. First we check if that cached object is not null and if it is an eye damageable. If it is an eye damageable, we check if it is facing us, and if it is stunned. The is stun boolean is changed during the stun animation we added in the previous devlog. If true, then we start the front grab animation. If false, we check if the eye damageable has its back to us and if it can be backstabbed. The backstab boolean is set from the inspector and will be determined by the type of enemy, since not all enemies can be backstabbed. If we pass the check, we start the backstab animation. If we don't, we perform a regular attack. Both the front and back grabs start an animation that has a grab event. The grab event works like this. It first casts a hit zone, and if that hit zone hits an eye damageable, it will perform some checks, according to the grab event data, whether it's a front or back stab, and if it requires being stunned. This might seem redundant because we already checked these things previously. However, this event is used for not just the player but also the enemies, so it's unavoidable to check it twice in the case of the player. Once the checks are passed, we perform the grab. When we perform the grab, we either change the grab initiator position or the grab target position, and then start playing the follow-up animation on both of them. Alright, let's see how everything was added step by step. I started by looking for animations in my asset project. One of the assets I had this execution scene, and I found this animation in it, but I only wanted the part where the stab and kick happens. So I went back to my project and created new clips for only the duration I wanted to use. One for the start of the grab and two more for the actual grab, one for each side. I then added the clips to the animator controllers, the grab start and grab itself to the player, and the grab target to the enemy. Next, I added some data to my existing grab event so that the skill handler class would perform some checks before executing the event. The grab event can now limit itself to only work on stun targets and limit itself to be a front or back stab only. Next, I created 3 different skill objects for those animations. Skill objects hold my animation events as well as other data, and I use them to activate the animation. Then on the grab start skill, I adjusted the grab event data, connected the follow-up skills, and adjusted the hit zone to match what I wanted it to be. And lastly, I adjusted the frame the event should start at. I then hooked the remaining names of the states in the controller to the skill objects. And started adding the events I thought would be needed for them as well. Now, since the skills are bound to the weapon wielded, I needed to add references in my weapon object for the front and back grab. I added these references and connected the front grab start skill to the sword I'm currently using. Now I just needed to know when to actually activate the grab. So I created a new script that casts a box in front of the player and caches what it hits. I started by adding a box cast info, which is just my scriptable objects, which represent the cast info. A cast object is a custom scriptable object I made to make it easier to adjust physical cast from the inspector. I also added a game object field to cache the data from the physical cast. The reason I separated this cast into its own class and not just perform the test as I attack is because I have a plan to use this information for things such as detecting treasure chests or ladders or whatever need I have in the future. So I only want to cast once in front of me in order to know what's there. The logic for the cast is very simple. If something was hit, store it. If not, set it to null. I then added the class into my player controller and called the function to cast from inside the player controller update function. I then went to my combo handler class, which is the class that handles the input when the player tries to attack. This class decides which skills to try and use depending on the state of the player. Whether it's the next attack in the combo, or a plunge attack if the character is on air, or an attack that follows a dash. I added this code in the section where the first regular attack in the combo is about to start. I now check if the front detection class has a last hit object. And if it does, I try to do a get component for an eye damageable. If that was successful, I do a dot check using the eye damageable forward direction and the player forward. If they are both looking in the same direction perfectly, the dot result will be 1, and that would mean the enemy has its back to the player. If they are looking at each other, the result will be -1. So if we're facing front to the enemy and the enemy is stunned, we try to do a front stab. If we're facing the back of the enemy and this enemy can be backstabbed, we do a backstab. Now it was time to test things out. So I pressed play and got an error. I forgot to attach the castable object for the front detection script. I also wanted to have a debug option so I can see the front cast itself, so I went and added that as well. I created a cast object for the class to use, adjusted its size, and connected it in the inspector. And things didn't work out correctly, so it's time to debug. First problem was the is stunned events weren't connected correctly. So even though the stunned animation was running, the is stunned boolean never got changed. Once I fixed that, I found out that I had a stack overflow created by a getter that was pointing to itself, which made Unity crash naturally. This honestly happens to me so many times. Too many times. Once Unity reopened, I tried again and things were finally working. Well, sort of working. Either way, I was making progress. I figured this issue was caused from collisions between the player and enemy colliders, so I added events in the skills that disabled them, which improved the result, but it wasn't correct just yet. The next issue was caused because I forgot to add an offset in the grab event itself, which caused the enemy to be in the same position as the player as soon as the grab event started. At this point, things were working correctly. However, it still didn't look alright to me, the way the animation worked with each other. So I tried playing around with it and improved it a bit. However, part of the problem is that the animation rotates a certain weapon bone that doesn't exist with the same hierarchy on my player model, so it doesn't get animated. I will fix this in the future when the player model receives its final version. Since the enemy drops to the ground during the grab, I wanted them to get up from the ground using the ragdoll system that the player uses. So I set up his own ragdoll. I just used Unity Ragdoll Wizard, connected everything up, and let it create the component it needed. And after the wizard finished, I just corrected some of the colliders that weren't sitting right. I then added the ragdoll event to the animation itself. Once I'd done that and added the ragdoll event, it was working perfectly, as you can see. The first problem was the wrong reference on my hit reaction handler script, which handles the ragdoll. After that was fixed, it actually returned back from the ragdoll, but it was still spazzing out. After these spectacular results, I adjusted the size of some of the colliders. And referenced some components in my hit reaction handler class to be turned off when the ragdoll starts and on back again when the ragdoll ends. Lastly, I also added a button in the inspector to allow me to test the ragdoll immediately without going into combat. At this point, the enemy stops spazzing out. And yes, spazzing out is the professional terminology. Finally, the ragdoll was working fine, but the stand-up animation wasn't transitioning correctly. It was transitioning correctly through the button, but not through the grab animation. I tried playing with the import options, but it didn't seem like that was the cause. Eventually, I tried turning off the aimIK component and it seemed to solve it, even though it shouldn't, because that component gets disabled when the ragdoll starts and re-enabled when the ragdoll ends. So it gets enabled after the ragdoll ends regardless. Even after editing this video and watching the full recording, I still don't know what fixed it. But it works, so yay! Even after all these fixes, something still didn't seem right to me about this interaction. So I tried taking a different approach to the positioning at the start of the grab. Instead of teleporting the grab target over one frame, I tried to move him over several frames, in the total distance he needed to compensate for. While testing, I also saw that while using the counter skill, if I input movement, the legs move during the animation. This wasn't by intended design. I wanted the legs to use the idle in the base layer, but not move during the animation. And while I could resolve this by fixing the code, I ended up deciding to move the counter ability to the override all layer and leave it at that. And because I was getting tired to actually fighting the enemy in order to just test the grab each time, I decided to build a dummy script that would just play the skills given to it on loop. It took a couple of hours to code and set up everything, but it was worth it. Faster ways to test are super important. Now that the front grab seemed to work fine, I want to select a back grab animation from my asset project. I've been kinda delaying it since none of the animation were exactly what I wanted, but I ended up picking these animations. I did the same process I did with the front grab. I imported the animations into the project, hooked them into the animator controller, and created 3 skill objects, 1 for the start of the grab and 2 for the follow-up. 1 follow-up for the grab initiator and 1 follow-up for the grab target. Now I was just continuously checking and tweaking values until the dot for the back and front grab seemed right. I also noticed the health bar wasn't updating from the self-damage event. The self-damage event is an event used by the grab target to deal damage to itself, based on the grab initiator damage. So, to explain this simply, when the player starts a grab event, the enemy who gets grabbed saves the damage data of the player at the start of the grab. And then when it has the self-damage event, it will use that data to deal damage to itself. So I did a temporary patch to fix this, and I completely forgot about it until I was editing this video. Oops. Realizing this as I was editing the video, I stopped everything and went to fix it properly this time. At this point, everything was working properly, but I still wasn't satisfied with how smooth the beginning of the grab was. This was the end of the day, so I decided to end it here for now. That night, I saw an Elden Ring review by Iron Pineapple, and I noticed that when the player grabs an enemy, they actually move the player. So the next day, I changed the grab events to work that way. I also noticed while testing that I didn't disable my rotation during the grabs, so I went and added events for that, and did even more tweaking. I thought I was done and I moved on to something else. But a few days later, as I was working on something else, my trusty enemy QA showed me I still need for certain grabs to move the target and not the grab initiator. Because of this. So I rewrote a lot of the code I deleted and gave the option to choose between the two ways in the grab event itself. Since there were so many fixes and changes in the code, I thought it would be better to just show it at the end in its final version. So let's go take a look. In the function that gets triggered when the grab event starts, first we call a function that starts a coroutine on the damage cast handler script. This function takes in a grab event data as well as a callback for an action with raycast hit array and an int. I cache the coroutine so that I can terminate it later in case the grab succeeds. The function itself starts a coroutine which casts a physics cast according to the grab event data. And each time something was hit, the onResult callback action will be called with the raycast hit array and the hit amount. On the callback function on grab result, I iterate over the results array and start with my checks. First, I check the hit has an entity hub, which is a script that holds references as well as action events for entities. Then I make sure the entity is currently not invincible. Then I make sure that if the grab event requires the target to be stunned, the target is actually stunned. Then if the grab event has a directional restriction, meaning it can only be front or back, I get my target transform and build a direction vector using this extension method I made. This method builds a direction vector from the vector calling it to the target vector supplied to it with the parameter. It then flattens the y and normalizes the vector. I do this because I only care for the XZ direction, and since I do this a lot, I added this as an extension method. I then do the same dots calculation as we saw in the combo handler, and then according to what the grab event tries to be, I perform the checks. If it's a front and we're not facing front, we continue, and the same for back. Finally, if we reach the end, we perform the grab and break the loop. At the perform grab function, we check if the grab is marked to move the grab target or the grabber. If we move the grab target, we first calculate its position by using the grabber transform and transforming the grab offset from the grab local position to world position using transform point function. After that, we rotate the grab target by calculating the direction from the target to the grabber, and then using the look rotation function to turn that into a rotation, and then multiply it by the y angle rotation value from the grab event to add to that rotation. If we move the grabber, we first calculate the end position by using the target transform point with the grab offset. This will transform the grab offset from the grab target local position to world position. And then we calculate the translation vector, which is the delta between our current grabber position and his end position. I then start a coroutine which moves our grabber for the delta position vector over time. And then I create a direction vector from the grabber end position to the target position and do a look rotation to get the rotation. Currently, I don't take into account the y angle rotation from the grab event and just set the grabber to face its target without giving it another option. If the need arises, I will add it in the future, but for now I don't have that need. Finally, I terminate the grab coroutine, as well as set the grab event to null. Then I reset both the grabber and grab target velocities and start the grab on both of them. When I start the grab on the target, I also give it the grabber damage snapshot, so that it could later damage itself using that data in the self-damage event. And that's it. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and please leave a like and subscribe as it helps a lot. And may all your bugs turn into features.